Chapter 10, The Courtship of Mary Beth. "Mary Beth," her father said as he ushered her into their living room, "there's someone here we would like you to meet." Mary Beth smiled and went with her father. She was always meeting extended family or friends of her parents and didn't think much about the request. As she entered the room, a young man sat at the sofa talking with her mother. Upon seeing her enter, he rose to his feet and took off the cap he'd been wearing. The daughter's smile faded slightly. Over the years, her parents had tried to stir an interest in the boys of higher society. She realized that they had now taken it upon themselves to search for someone for her. Everyone mistook her hesitancy to be the result of shyness and nerves. He was a nice-looking young man with short blonde hair and green eyes. He wore a collared shirt under a V-neck sweater, and immediately reminded Mary Beth of the pictures of the college students in the brochure she'd been looking at. The father made a motion to the young man, and he abruptly began, Miss Jameson, I'm Alexander Foundland. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." He extended his right hand and waited. "Mr. Foundland, it's a pleasure to meet you, though I'd have thought your visit might have been mentioned beforehand." She nodded to her mother as she said this. "Darling," her mother chirped, "his father is a business associate of your father. Both of them thought you might become good friends. The young man has only just moved into his own home in Williamston several months ago and has not met many young people his own age yet." At a motion from Mrs. Jameson, Alexander sat back down and she resumed her seat next to him. Mary Beth hesitated before taking a seat across from Alexander on another sofa, and her father sat beside her. At first, Mary Beth was still too startled to say much, and the visitor was timid and uncertain of what to say as well. Finally, she plucked up the courage and asked, "My father works with all sorts of people, so exactly what's your father's line of work?" She intended it to sound very casual, but it came out more like part of an interrogation. "Oh, my father is an investor of sorts, mainly real estate, but he dabbles in many different areas. It's something he calls diversifying. I've been working under him as an apprentice, and hopefully after I finish college, I'll be made a full partner like my older brother." "Oh, I've been looking into colleges. Where do you go?" "I'm taking some summer classes at Lawton Community College, but I'm planning on doing my main work over at Brown University. Where are you planning on going?" Mary Beth knew someone going to Brown obviously came from money, but it impressed her that he didn't think himself too good for the local school, as did most of the wealthy crowd. She answered, "Well, I don't really know what I want to study yet, so I'm just looking into Lawton for the fall. I can work toward an associate degree while I'm deciding." "That's a fine plan," Alexander said. "Though do keep in mind some of the bigger schools, Harvard or Yale, for instance, won't accept LCC's credits. Brown would take them, but I'm not taking them for a grade, just auditing them." She began to enjoy the conversation a little more. She said to herself, "Why shouldn't I? After all, this surprise meeting is not Alexander's fault." The maid set out tea and a plate of finger foods. Between snacking and conversation, the visit lasted nearly an hour, but didn't get beyond simple things like favorite school subjects and current events. After the visit, the family led Alexander to the door. Mary Beth noticed her parents giving a sly smile to one another. The first meeting went better than they hoped. After the door closed, Mary Beth asked, "What have you two been up to? Am I going to have any more surprise visitors that I'd like to know about up front?" The father responded, "We thought you two would hit it off so well. Didn't you like the young man? He seemed very nice to me." "It's not that. Yes, he did seem very nice, and perhaps I'd like to get to know him better. I'm just a little bothered that you didn't ask me about this before he showed up at the door." "You're right, my love," her mother sighed. "Still, you seemed so lonely all this month, but we were certain if we asked, you'd be dead set against it and refuse. What's the harm in meeting new people?" Mary Beth ignored this question. She was glad the visit hadn't lasted much longer. It was her day to meet with Mrs. Stevens, and she now had even more to talk about. She asked her parents, "It's only a little early, and so I'm going to head over to the parsonage now, if that's okay." They agreed, and she was off at once. Pastor Stevens answered the knock at the door and found Mary Beth waiting on the porch. She looked perplexed and was so deep in thought that she didn't immediately acknowledge the pastor. He had been unable to come to the door right away because he was carrying a load of firewood and she drifted off in thought. The pastor exclaimed, "Why, Mary Beth, pray tell what planet might you be visiting today?" "Sorry, Pastor," she smiled broadly. "It's just something that happened at home and I wonder what's going to become of it. Not to mention how it's going to affect other things." "I have no idea what you're talking about, but go on into my office and wait for my wife. She's down in the cellar getting some canned meat for dinner. I'll go tell her you're here." She had barely taken a seat when Mrs. Stevens joined her. "Mary Beth, good to see you." They shared a quick hug as the pastor's wife continued. "My husband said you seemed to have something important on your mind." Mary Beth explained the surprise introduction of Alexander to Mrs. Stevens. Afterwards she added, "I thought that my friendship with Johnny would just keep going and going, but it's hard with him being so far away. Now my parents want me to get to know other people. And mark my words, they're trying to find me a husband that suits them." "Whoa now, I'm sure they have no designs on you being married off tomorrow. And why should a nice young girl like you shy away from making new friends? Boys as well as girls." "But what would Johnny say?" Mary Beth asked. "I'm sure he wouldn't be pleased, though he never kept me from making friends with other boys before. I think this time it's different." "What's the harm in this? If you and Johnny should be together, this will only serve to help you know. I say you should get to know this new young man better, and at very least find a new friend. I think it would be the best thing in the world for Johnny to do the same thing over in Lawton. It was very nice to have a visitor, and someone my parents won't give me fits about. Still, I worry how Johnny will take it. He's supposed to call me in a couple of weeks. Should I try to talk to him sooner than that?" "It's not like you're promised to each other or anything." "You haven't, have you? I mean, made any promises of marriage or something silly? You're both so young." Mary Beth shook her head to indicate no. Good, good. That weekend, Alexander accompanied Mary Beth to a church banquet. Mary Beth took Mrs. Stevens' advice and gave her best effort in getting to know her new friend. He also hit it off with everyone Mary Beth valued, the pastor and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Samuels, and others as well. Mary Beth didn't care for all the fuss her parents made introducing him to everyone, but she could hardly fault the young man for that. Mary Beth and Alexander began to spend quite a bit of time together. She began to hold him nearly as dear to her heart as she did Johnny. It also meant so much that her parents accepted him. After a time, she didn't think about Johnny as often and even began to think she might have a future with Alexander. Then the time for the phone call came and went. She was anxious for the call, but she'd seen a short report on the fire, so she expected it might be late in coming. Later that same week, Mary Beth was at the parsonage for another meeting. The pastor said, "You know, Johnny is supposed to come by here for his monthly meeting this coming Saturday. You could swing by and talk to him in person." "That'll never do," Mary Beth explained. "My family reunion is the same day and it's out of state. Could you please tell him for me? I've been fretting over what to say." The pastor agreed to this arrangement, but his wife gave him a look that said she wasn't entirely pleased. After Mary Beth left, she told her husband, "You know, I think it would have been good for her to have to tell him herself. The tough things are the learning things, you know." He explained, "It's not her that I'm particularly concerned about. I think it would be best for Johnny to hear it from a more subjective third party like myself. He's just starting to find his own place in the world, but I'm not sure he's quite ready for his first major crisis of life." The following Saturday in the church library, the pastor finally broke his silence and told Johnny, "Mary Beth has a suitor. There's a young man interested in having her hand in marriage. Her parents introduced him to her. Now they have not actually said anything about marriage yet, but this is how the wealthy go about the process. Of course, nothing might come of the situation in the end, but she's been spending a good deal of time with him." "I'm only away for a month and she forgets about me already?" Johnny complained bitterly. "I miss her already, never mind forgetting to call her, and now she's to be gone out of my life as well?" "Don't take it so hard, Johnny. Now, you're not going to like this next part any better. My wife and I told her she should explore the possibility. If it's meant to be, then you need to be a big man and not stand in her way. But if you and she are meant to be, well, this is just the sort of thing that needs to happen to see that clearly. This happening is for your own good." Johnny gave a big sigh and added, I suppose you're going to tell me that it's natural for my heart to ache over this, but that the heart is there to deceive us. That's about what I'd say, but boy, you do have a way of making it sound more negative than I'd have intended. The heart has its place, make no mistake, but we also have a mind for a reason. After a bit more talk, the pastor told Johnny, I know we talked about the possibility of having you stay over next Saturday for church on Sunday, but I don't think it'll work out. Why don't we plan on it after your regular mentoring session next month? Johnny agreed to this and didn't give it a second thought. Of course, the pastor didn't mention the reason. Mary Beth and Alexander were singing a duet for the special music, something Mrs. Jameson had arranged. The pastor thought this wouldn't be the best time for Johnny to meet Mary Beth's new friend. Many of the people at church had already met the young man at the banquet earlier in the month, so nobody was caught off guard when Mary Beth and Alexander took to the platform. Nobody, that is, except Miss Johnson and the orphans. Quite a murmur went through the balcony, but Miss Johnson put a quick finger to her pursed lips and all the children became silent. After they sang, Mary Beth and Alexander sat side by side next to her parents and the service proceeded. When the service ended, the young couple had a chance to compare notes on the singing experience. The practices had allowed them to spend much time getting to know one another. Alexander really didn't have much to say about the experience, but he did make other remarks. What's with that group of children and that old woman up in the balcony? And did you get a load of that one they had all dolled up? I declare I couldn't have made out her face if I wanted to. I wonder that the pastor tolerates such a bunch of rabble. Though Mary Beth had to ball up her toes, she tried very hard not to show any outward sign that his comments bothered her. All the same, he should have known from the way she spoke that she wasn't at all pleased. She calmly replied, They aren't rabble, they're just children from the orphanage. They do the best they can with what they have, and I'd appreciate it greatly if you gave them half a chance. I think that it's simply splendid that the pastor tolerates them. Alexander did notice it enough to say, Just making conversation, Mary. Don't read too much into it. He immediately put it out of his mind, but Mary Beth continued to mull it over for some time afterwards. Exiting the auditorium, Alexander walked over to shake the pastor's hand. Fine job on your message today, Pastor. I couldn't agree more. Keep up the good work. As Alexander drove Mary Beth home, he revealed his true thoughts on the day's sermon, and again he would have done better to keep his mouth closed. I don't quite get why that pastor went on about that do unto others bit today. Mary Beth explained, It's just saying not to be hypocrites, treating people in ways we wouldn't want them treating us. Not leaving well enough alone, he continued, My father says, in business at least, to get them before they get you, and that's how a dollar is made. You have to temper all that religious stuff with a bit more practicality. The pastor seems too intelligent to have missed that point. Mary Beth once again dug her toes deep into the bottom of her shoes and her cheeks flushed slightly. His comments only bothered her half as much as the fact that he contradicted everything he said earlier to the pastor's face. She didn't speak the rest of the ride home. Even as the family prepared for dinner, to which Alexander was invited, she was a little icy towards her new friend. Alexander was starting to realize that something was amiss, but the parents had realized it almost immediately. The husband gave a look to his wife and knew she was aware as well. Mary Beth, dear, the mother asked, can you give me a quick hand in the kitchen? I think the dessert will need tended to if it's to be ready after the meal. The husband went into the living room with Alexander to inform him that he'd done something to displease his daughter. He also wanted to get the young man's take on what exactly had gone awry. Alexander wasn't entirely certain where the problem arose, but he repeated the main gist of their conversation. The father shook his head and commented, You have much to learn about my daughter. Now first you're going to have to apologize, and then you're going to need to realize that not every thought you have is to be shared with Mary Beth, not if you are to have a future together. The father then told the young man exactly how he should handle the present situation. Likewise, the mother had a similar conversation with Mary Beth, during which Mrs. Jameson replied, Now, dear, don't be too hard on him. He's just a young man and all, just learning his place in the world. I'm sure he didn't mean any of it quite as harshly as you've taken it. Try to remember you've always been a bit overly sensitive. If you don't start taking these things with a grain of salt, you'll never find a husband to suit you. The couples both returned to the dining room, and Alexander gently guided Mary Beth by the elbow to a quiet corner to apologize. "I've been thinking about what I said in the car earlier, and I'm afraid it must have sounded just beastly. I only meant to say the pastor should have made some adjustments for people and their issues for them to get the point. As for the orphanage, I just thought so many children with so few adults were bound to cause distractions." The two of them continued to talk for several more minutes, and now everything he said seemed perfect to Mary Beth. Soon she began to think her mother was right about taking things too harshly, and she put the whole incident at church and in the car out of her mind. For a time, at least. Mary Beth and Alexander spent more time together at family gatherings, church functions, and an occasional picnic by themselves. He said more of the right things and less of the wrong things as time went by. Mary Beth noted that Alexander even seemed to enjoy spending time with her father. The two were always going off to a corner to chat. Mary Beth liked the fact that Alexander was like part of the family. This was something that hadn't been possible with Johnny, though by no fault of Johnny's. One day Alexander's parents were in Town's End. The father had an important meeting at Mayor Phillips' home. Alexander swung by the mayor's home with Mary Beth. His whole family was going to leave from there for a picnic with Mary Beth. The mayor's home was a large southern plantation-style home with 2-story columns along the front. Mary Beth had been by it several times and had always wanted to see the inside, and today she had the chance. Alexander had been to the mayor's home several times before, so the maid let them into the foyer. It was a grand room with several paintings and a few sculptures. Mary Beth began to look around a little. Alexander said, "Mary Beth, while you're looking around, I'll go find out where the ladies are visiting and you can join them. Then I'll be needed in the meeting for a spell, but you'll enjoy my mother. She's quite the entertainer." To one side, a double door stood partly open, and something inside caught her eye. It was the mayor's private office, and in the middle, there was a table displaying several architectural models. As she neared, she realized it was actually a model of a town. Mary Beth studied the model for several minutes and thought she recognized several of the larger, more prominent buildings of Town's End. It was confusing because several buildings that ought to have been there were absent, and other buildings took their places. She began to see that it wasn't a town at all, but some sort of a resort community. Then for the first time she became aware of two voices talking low. Looking around, she saw two men looking out the windows towards town. They apparently hadn't heard her enter the room, and though she tried not to, she found herself overhearing parts of their conversation. A lot of the rental properties are going up on the market. It seems they can't keep tenants for all the town's ordinances that keep going up. Some of our other investors have been able to snatch them up at great prices. Aren't some of the other properties going to be a bit trickier to get a hold of, though? That old burned-out place up by Miller Park will be easy enough. Jonas is going to push through an ordinance turning abandoned properties over to the city. There's no hurry, though. I doubt there's much risk of anybody making a claim on the place. Foreclosures will also take care of some family homes. Quite handy having Alexander Sr. and Jonas both on the bank's board of directors. That still leaves properties that are paid off and owner-occupied. I suppose some will sell when the town becomes more and more vacant, but I dare say a few will realize what's going on and hold out for good prices. We'll probably just need to ante up and buy a few outright. Of course, the church will fold once the residents leave, but I doubt the old woman at the orphanage is going to sell out. Money isn't the highest thing on their agenda. Besides, where would they go? That's going to be the real trick. That orphan boy turning up that letter old Jonas had buried really messed that up. I think Jonas is working on something with his other group that might just break that old director's will. Take the wind out of her sails, so to speak. We'll have to wait and see what becomes of all that. Mary Beth looked at the model to see the church building converted into a much larger theater area. She looked for where she thought the orphanage was. It was difficult to tell, but she thought a large hotel might be the school after renovations. That meant the large parking lot was the site of the present orphanage. Mary Beth also realized she was hearing secret things not meant for her or anyone but the mayor's friends to know about. She quietly began tiptoeing from the room. No sooner had she exited from the office than Mayor Phillips came into the foyer. She was standing in front of the office doorway, but no one would have necessarily thought she just exited the room. Mayor Phillips casually smiled and said, "No need to be looking into my office now then, young lady." He reached past her and pulled the doors closed. "No offense, mind you, but I do have my private business concerns. And while I do stress the word private." Mary nodded and feigned a smile in return. She stumbled slightly as though she'd lost her balance. She caught herself on the frame of the doorway, but she still felt as though the room were spinning. The mayor recognized her actions as signs of someone about to faint. He caught her elbow and eased her into a sofa beside the front door. "Easy there, child," the mayor said. "I do believe you've nearly fainted, and you still do look quite pale. Rest here a moment. No, don't get up. Just keep your head low until it passes. Should I fetch one of my servant girls to assist you?" In a soft, quiet voice she replied, "No, sir, I don't know what came over me, but I feel it has passed now. Perhaps I should find Alexander and talk about maybe taking me home." "You will find him over by the dining room talking with some of our associates." Just then he flagged a maid who happened to be passing by. "Here, lend the woman your arm and she can lead you to Alexander. Marilyn, that would be Alexander Jr. And young lady, as soon as you've spoken to your young man, please tell him the meeting will begin in 5 minutes. The maid led Mary Beth by the arm and they walked down a short hallway. She recognized Alexander's shoulder as he leaned against the doorpost. She felt much better, thanked and dismissed the maid before proceeding down the hallway alone. As she approached, she again overheard things not meant for her ears. "Father," Mary Beth recognized Alexander's voice. "She's such a lovely thing, and I believe we could be ever so happy together. But what should I do about that overactive social conscience of hers? That could make for many a cold night on the couch, especially as our plans proceed. Junior, need I remind you that marriage is 1 part heart to 2 parts business? We're going to need to have the Jamesons in our back pocket for the line of business we're pursuing. Besides, her conscience could help keep you from offending the populace if you should pursue politics or otherwise need to market your reputation among the commoners." Mary Beth suddenly felt lightheaded, and again the world began to spin. She tried to back down the hallway, edging herself against the wall. She managed to get out of earshot before she lost her footing and stumbled down on one knee. Hearing the stumbling, Alexander turned to see her and rushed to her side. "Mary Beth," he exclaimed, "what's the matter? Why, I declare you look so very white. If you're not feeling well, then I wish you had said something earlier." He helped Mary Beth to his feet and began leading her to his car. "I felt fine earlier, but I don't feel at all fine now. The mayor said you needed to be there in 5 minutes, but I do wish you'd take me home before your meeting. I feel that I should lie down for a spell." Alexander grimaced and said, "I wish it were possible, dear, but this is quite an important meeting. The mayor is sure to have a couch or a daybed at your disposal. Perhaps this will pass before the meeting finishes. I do wish I could lie down in my own bed. I'm afraid even if it passes, I don't feel up to lunch with your family now. Is there anyone who could drive me home?" "Well, you might as well at least get to spend some time with my mother. She's quite as capable of driving as my father, and she won't be needed in the meeting. Yes, I think that'll be best. Not as good as a picnic when you're feeling good, but you will still meet Mother. She also makes such a good nurse when one isn't feeling well." Mary said very little, but Mrs. Foundland had a very comforting way about her. The woman wasn't in the least perturbed by Mary Beth's silence and chatted merrily along. Instead of annoying her, Mary Beth found her voice quite soothing. Mrs. Foundland spoke of her charities and the crafts she worked at to occupy herself while the men of her home were out doing their business. Noting the woman's benevolent nature, she wondered how she could tolerate her spouse's malevolence. Perhaps she was unaware. Mary Beth didn't even try to tell her parents what had happened at the mayor's home. Instead, she lay in her bed until about 1 in the afternoon. As she was staring at the ceiling, a soft knock came at her door. Her mother peeked in the door carrying a platter with a bowl of soup and some sandwiches. Mary Beth didn't feel particularly hungry, but knew it would make her feel better to eat something all the same. She smiled and motioned to her mother to come in. "Mary Beth, darling," her mother cooed, "whatever is the matter? I'm so sure I believe this is just some sudden sickness. Are you certain nothing happened at the mayor's home you wanted to talk about?" "Mother," Mary Beth explained, I overheard some things. I wasn't trying to, but I just couldn't help but listen once I caught the point of it. I also heard Alexander discussing me with his father like some business exchange. The mother asked, "What sort of things would bother you so, dear? And what do you mean about this Alexander business? Did you know that the mayor is a board member of the bank? He's not so much interested in being mayor as he is in getting all the property in Town's End. It all seems so secretive and dishonest. Alexander and his father were talking about marriage like it was mostly about business and wanting to have our family married into their schemes. Mary, dear," her father spoke as he entered the room, "when young Alexander seemed interested in the prospect of courting you, we were quite pleased, because in all ways he seems a fine young man. On top of that, why not enjoy the business advantages that a good marriage can bring to a family? We knew something big was going on with the mayor's plans and that Alexander's family somehow figured into it." "Do try not to dismiss Alexander so quickly," her mother advised. "Men think differently than women do, dear. Things tend to be more business and less heart with them. To be sure, I had to make some concessions to be with your father, but look what a comfortable life I've had for it. Why, with anybody else—" Mary Beth couldn't help interrupting. "So you knew something was up and figured you could marry me into it as your ticket to get in on it? How very boorish. You don't understand what these people are planning. It looks to me like there won't be a Townsend when they're done, and they're going to get rid of everything I care about in the process. You sound just as bad as they did. I want nothing more to do with Alexander and his schemes, and I don't want to hear one more word about it either." With that, Mary Beth pushed the soup away and rolled over in her bed, looking out the window. Her parents just exchanged a look of hopelessness. They knew that it would be nearly impossible to get anywhere with their daughter in this state. They closed the door behind them, and she could hear murmurs as they discussed things in the hallway. Once the talking died away, Mary Beth got up and went to her desk. Taking a piece of stationery, she began to write a letter. "Dear Johnny," and continued to write with an occasional pause to think about what she'd say. This correspondence began a series of letters that went back and forth between the two. They worked them in among the applications and letters to and from the universities. Mary Beth deposited all her letters in the mailbox by her own hand, and Johnny was careful to use business-sized envelopes and to omit the return address, to avoid the suspicion of her parents. Mary Beth wasn't about to give her parents another chance at pushing Alexander, or another very much like him, on her. She had to find someone who shared her beliefs and her values, or there was no future in it. She no longer trusted her parents' judgment to find someone to fit this bill. She saw the bottom line with them was business advantage and a comfortable life. Mary Beth was far more interested in the principles of things to be contented with such a life as that